Sometimes the smallest arms reveal the biggest truth. The little girl broke free before anyone could stop her. Tiny dress, shoes tapped across the polished marble floor of Harrison Global Headquarters, echoing through the vast atrium where executives in tailored suits paused mid-conversation. Security guards instinctively turned. Receptionists looked up from glowing computer screens. A pair of investors froze beside the glass elevators. Every eye followed the 8-year-old as she sprinted toward the man pushing a worn janitor's cart across the lobby. Ethan Brooks looked up in surprise, one hand still wrapped around the mop handle. His faded blue work shirt bore a small stitched name tag, its edges beginning to fray after years of washing. A bottle of glass cleaner rested beside neatly folded microfiber towels, and the faint scent of lemon polish lingered in the quiet morning air. Before he could say a single word, the little girl threw both arms around him with all the strength her small body could manage. She held him tightly, burying her face against his chest as though she had finally found the safest place in the world. "I missed you," Sophie whispered, her trembling voice barely louder than a breath. The bustling lobby fell silent. No ringing phones. No clicking heels. No elevator chimes. Even the soft hum of the climate system seemed to disappear beneath the weight of the moment. Ethan hesitated for only a heartbeat before gently placing one hand on the child's shoulder. His expression remained calm, almost puzzled, yet filled with the quiet kindness that had become second nature after years of carrying burdens no one else ever noticed. "Good morning, Sophie," he said softly. "Looks like you've gotten taller again." A few employees exchanged confused glances. Someone near the reception desk quietly asked, "Does he know her?" Another answered with a shrug. Nobody seemed to understand why the billionaire's daughter knew the building's cleaner by name. At that exact moment, the private elevator door slid open with a quiet chime. Richard Harrison stepped into the lobby surrounded by attorneys, board members, and 2 executive assistants carrying leather portfolios. His presence alone usually commanded instant attention. Today was no different, until he noticed his daughter standing in the middle of the lobby with her arms wrapped around a maintenance worker. His footsteps stopped. His face tightened with confusion before hardening into concern. "Sophie," he called firmly. The child didn't move. She only held Ethan closer. Richard crossed the marble floor with measured strides, every executive following several steps behind. Security instinctively closed in from opposite sides of the lobby. Whispers rippled across the crowd like wind across still water. Ethan slowly released the mop handle and looked toward the approaching billionaire without fear or resentment. Years of hardship had taught him that dignity required neither loud words nor angry gestures. Richard's voice grew colder as he reached them. "Young lady, come here." Sophie finally looked up, tears shining in her bright blue eyes. She shook her head. "No, Daddy." Richard blinked, caught off guard by the answer. "He isn't bothering me," she continued, clutching Ethan's arm again. "He's my hero." A stunned silence settled over every corner of the atrium. Richard's gaze shifted from his daughter's tearful face to the quiet cleaner standing before him. For the first time, he truly looked into Ethan Brooks' eyes, and somewhere deep beneath years of success, power, and forgotten memories, something impossible began to stir. Richard Harrison did not speak for several long seconds. He simply studied the quiet man standing before him, while Sophie continued holding his arm as though letting go would somehow erase the comfort she had found. Ethan lowered his eyes respectfully, not because he was ashamed, but because he had spent years believing that humility spoke louder than pride. Around them, whispers spread through the lobby. Some employees assumed the cleaner had crossed an invisible line. Others wondered whether they were about to witness the end of a man's career. None of them knew the man behind the faded work shirt. None of them had ever asked. Ethan Brooks arrived every weekday before 5 o'clock in the morning, nearly 3 hours before the first executive entered the building. The city streets were still dark when his aging pickup truck rolled quietly into the underground parking garage. He always parked in the farthest corner, not because anyone told him to, but because he believed the closest spaces belonged to people carrying heavier responsibilities than his own. Every morning followed the same rhythm. He filled a weathered bucket with warm water, measured the cleaning solution carefully, checked every supply cart, and walked each hallway before sunrise. The polished marble floors reflected the first rays of daylight through the towering glass walls while the building remained silent except for the gentle squeak of his mop and the distant hum of ventilation fans. Ethan appreciated those quiet hours. Nobody judged him before sunrise. Nobody looked past him because of the uniform he wore. He simply took pride in leaving every surface cleaner than he had found it. His coworkers often described him with the same words: quiet, reliable, invisible. Some forgot his name entirely and called him maintenance. Others nodded politely without ever learning anything about the man pushing the cart. Ethan never complained. Life had already taught him that respect earned through character lasted much longer than attention demanded through noise. Every afternoon, just before school dismissed, he checked the old photograph tucked safely inside his wallet. It showed a smiling little girl with freckles and shoulder-length blonde hair standing beside a wooden swing set. Her name was Lily Brooks, his 10-year-old daughter, and the center of his entire world. Since losing his wife years earlier to a sudden illness, Ethan had learned to become both father and mother, helping with homework after long shifts, packing school lunches before dawn, reading bedtime stories despite exhausted eyes, and never allowing his daughter to see how carefully every dollar had to be stretched. New shoes often waited until the next paycheck. Family vacations became afternoons at the community park. Birthday celebrations happened around homemade cakes instead of expensive restaurants. Yet Lily never complained. She often smiled and told her father that the best part of every day was simply having dinner together. That simple sentence carried Ethan through countless difficult mornings. Perhaps that was why he noticed lonely children so easily. He recognized quiet sadness because he had lived beside it himself. Weeks earlier, he had first met Sophie sitting alone near the indoor fountain, while a corporate charity event filled the upper ballroom. The little girl had been surrounded by hundreds of successful adults, yet somehow looked completely by herself. Ethan had quietly offered her a folded paper crane made from a discarded meeting agenda. She had smiled for the first time that afternoon. The next day, she came looking for him again. Then again the following week. They talked about books, school projects, birds nesting outside the office windows, and her favorite chocolate chip cookies. Never once did Ethan ask whose daughter she was. Never once did Sophie mention that her last name was Harrison. To Ethan, she was simply another child who needed someone willing to listen. Richard Harrison remained silent, but the silence no longer carried only authority. It carried questions. Sophie slowly loosened her embrace, though her small hand still rested gently around Ethan's wrist as if she feared someone might separate them. The executives behind Richard shifted uneasily, exchanging cautious glances without daring to interrupt. Nobody understood how a little girl raised in one of the wealthiest families in the country had formed such an unshakable bond with the quiet cleaner who polished their floors every morning. The answer had never happened during one dramatic moment. It had been built through dozens of ordinary ones. Nearly 3 months earlier, Sophie had wandered away from another endless corporate event. Her father had been speaking before shareholders upstairs while photographers crowded around the ballroom entrance. The adults talked about market growth, acquisitions, and quarterly reports. Sophie had quietly slipped away searching for somewhere that did not feel so loud. She eventually found herself standing beside the indoor fountain in the lobby, watching tiny ripples dance across the water. Beneath the morning sunlight, Ethan noticed her from across the hall while replacing a trash liner. He did not recognize her expensive shoes or designer sweater. He simply saw a child sitting alone with shoulders that looked far too heavy for someone her age. He approached slowly, careful not to startle her. "That fountain has 4 turtles carved into the stone," he said with a gentle smile. "Most people never notice them." Sophie looked up with curious eyes before counting each small carving around the fountain's edge. When she discovered the 4th turtle hidden beneath a flower, she smiled for the first time that day. "You were right," she whispered. Ethan nodded. Sometimes the best things are the ones people overlook. The words stayed with her long after he returned to work. A few days later, she found him again while he carefully polished fingerprints from the enormous glass windows overlooking the city. She carried a science book tucked beneath her arm and asked why birds never crashed into some windows but struck others. Ethan explained reflections, sunlight, and simple ways architects could help birds recognize glass. He spoke patiently, never talking down to her, never rushing the conversation even though his cart waited nearby. Sophie listened with complete attention because Ethan answered her questions the way her late mother once had, with warmth instead of hurry. Their conversations became a quiet routine, hidden inside the rhythm of the building. Sometimes Ethan folded paper airplanes from scrap office paper. Other days he taught her how to identify clouds drifting above the skyline. Once he repaired the loose wheel on her favorite backpack using nothing more than a small screwdriver from his maintenance kit. Another afternoon, he noticed she looked unusually quiet. "Rough day?" he asked. Sophie stared at the polished floor before answering. "Everyone wants something from my dad." Ethan leaned lightly against the cleaning cart. "That must make it difficult sometimes." She nodded. "I never know if people like me or my last name." Ethan smiled softly. "Then do not let your last name become the most interesting thing about you." Sophie considered his words for several moments. "What should be the most interesting thing?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "Your heart. Nobody can borrow that from someone else." She remembered every word. She began leaving small drawings inside his supply cart. He responded by leaving folded paper cranes or handwritten riddles for her to solve after school. Neither of them realized curious eyes had started watching from a distance. One building operations manager noticed the growing friendship and frowned each time the little girl visited the maintenance corridor. To him, it did not look like innocent conversations. It looked like a problem waiting to happen. And while Ethan continued believing he was simply helping a lonely child smile again, someone else quietly began preparing a very different story. The building operations manager was named Daniel Mercer, and for years he had believed that every problem could be solved before it reached the executive floor. He valued order, appearances, and reputation above everything else. So when he noticed the chairman's daughter laughing beside a cleaner instead of attending carefully planned corporate events, he did not see kindness. He saw risk. Every afternoon, Daniel quietly observed from the second-floor balcony while pretending to review maintenance schedules on his tablet. He watched Sophie wander toward Ethan's cleaning cart with an excitement she never showed during board dinners or charity photographs. He saw Ethan hand her folded paper birds, answer endless questions, and smile with the patient calm of a father who had long ago learned that children remembered how adults made them feel far more than what they said. Daniel never bothered listening closely enough to hear the conversations. Instead, he allowed assumptions to become conclusions. One Monday morning, he called two supervisors into his office. "This has gone too far," he said, folding his hands across the polished walnut desk. "The chairman cannot discover that his daughter spends half her afternoons following a maintenance employee around the building." One supervisor hesitated. "Sir, the cleaner has never caused any problems." Daniel frowned. "Problems rarely announce themselves before they happen." The room fell quiet. Outside the office windows, sunlight reflected against neighboring skyscrapers while traffic drifted steadily through downtown streets nearly 40 stories below. Daniel opened several security recordings from the previous weeks. The footage showed Sophie greeting Ethan, sitting beside his supply cart, laughing at one of his paper puzzles, and waving goodbye before returning upstairs. There was nothing improper, nothing alarming, nothing except genuine warmth. Yet Daniel selected only the brief moments that appeared unusual without their surrounding context. A child hugging an employee, a cleaner kneeling to repair a backpack wheel, a conversation in an empty hallway before office hours. Piece by piece, ordinary kindness became suspicious through careful editing. Meanwhile, Ethan remained completely unaware. His greatest concern that week was finding enough overtime to replace the brakes on his old pickup truck before winter arrived. During lunch breaks, he called Lily to remind her about her spelling test and asked whether she had remembered to pack the apple slices he prepared before dawn. Lily laughed and promised she had. Those small conversations were worth more to Ethan than any promotion could ever be. On Wednesday afternoon, Sophie appeared again carrying a small notebook covered with colorful stickers. "Look," she said excitedly. "I got an A+ on my science project." Ethan smiled with genuine pride. "I knew you would. Because you helped me understand the birds and the windows." Ethan gently shook his head. "No, Sophie. I only answer questions. You did the hard work." She beamed beneath the afternoon sunlight pouring through the glass walls. Neither of them noticed Daniel watching from across the atrium with growing frustration. Later that evening, he prepared a confidential report marked for executive review. The language sounded professional, but every sentence leaned toward suspicion. It suggested that a maintenance employee had developed an unusual relationship with the chairman's daughter. It recommended immediate intervention before the situation attracted outside attention. By sunrise the following morning, copies of the report rested on the desks of senior executives. Quiet whispers spread through departments that had never spoken to Ethan before. Employees who once ignored him now glanced in his direction before lowering their voices. Conversations stopped whenever he pushed his cart past conference rooms. Even the security officers greeted him with guarded expressions instead of familiar smiles. Ethan noticed the change, but chose not to ask questions. He simply continued polishing windows, emptying trash bins, and wishing strangers a good morning. He believed that truth had a way of surviving misunderstandings if a person refused to abandon kindness. What he did not know was that Richard Harrison had already received Daniel Mercer's report, and before another day ended, the chairman had quietly ordered a private meeting that would place one ordinary cleaner at the center of the most important decision of his life. By 9 o'clock the following morning, word had quietly spread throughout Harrison Global that the chairman himself wanted to see the cleaner from the maintenance department. Nobody knew exactly why, but rumors moved faster than facts. Some whispered that Ethan Brooks had violated company policy. Others claimed security had uncovered something hidden in the surveillance recordings. A few employees simply shook their heads with sympathy, convinced the quiet man would never return after walking into the executive lobby. Ethan received the message while replacing fresh flowers in the reception area. The young receptionist looked uncomfortable as she approached. "Mr. Brooks, the chairman has requested your presence in the main atrium." Ethan offered the same calm smile he gave everyone else. "Thank you. I will finish this first." She blinked in surprise. "You are not going right away?" Ethan carefully adjusted a vase that leaned slightly to one side. Flowers should not wait because people are nervous. The receptionist watched him for a moment before lowering her eyes. Somehow his steady voice made her feel more anxious than if he had argued. 10 minutes later, Ethan quietly pushed his cleaning cart across the polished marble floor toward the center of the building. The vast atrium had become unusually crowded. Executives stood near the glass elevators pretending to review documents while secretly watching. Administrative assistants gathered near the coffee station. Security officers remained respectfully along the walls. Daniel Mercer stood several feet behind Richard Harrison, confident that the evidence he had prepared would finally convince the chairman that immediate action was necessary. Richard remained expressionless. His report rested inside a slim leather folder tucked beneath one arm, but he had not opened it since arriving downstairs. Something about his daughter's reaction the previous day continued to trouble him. Children could be persuaded to smile for cameras. They could be coached to wave at charity events, but they could never fake complete trust. Ethan stopped several feet away and rested both hands lightly on the handle of his maintenance cart. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison." Richard studied him carefully. "Mr. Brooks, thank you for coming." Daniel stepped forward before either man could continue. "Sir, perhaps we should discuss this privately." Richard raised one hand without looking away from Ethan. "No. Whatever needs to be said can be said here." The lobby became even quieter. Daniel cleared his throat and opened a tablet displaying selected security images. Over the past several weeks, this employee has developed repeated unsupervised contact with Miss Harrison. He swiped through carefully chosen photographs that stripped away every innocent conversation and left only moments that appeared suspicious. Ethan looked at the screen without interrupting. Richard's face remained impossible to read. "Mr. Brooks," Richard finally asked, "why have you spent so much time with my daughter?" Before Ethan could answer, a familiar voice echoed across the marble floor. "Because I kept finding him." Every head turned at once. Sophie had slipped away from her tutor upstairs and was running toward the gathering as fast as her small legs could carry her. One security officer instinctively moved to intercept her, but Richard quietly motioned for him to step aside. Sophie reached Ethan without slowing down and wrapped both arms tightly around his waist. The movement happened so naturally that it felt less like a decision and more like a child finally reaching home after a long journey. She looked up at her father with tears beginning to fill her eyes. "Please do not send him away." Richard's shoulders stiffened. "Sweetheart, nobody has decided anything." Sophie shook her head. "They think he is the problem." Her voice cracked as she held Ethan's hand. "But when everybody else was busy, He was the only person who noticed I was lonely. The words settled over the atrium with a weight no executive report could ever match. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Daniel slowly lowered his tablet as uncertain expressions spread across the faces surrounding him. Richard looked from his daughter to the quiet cleaner standing beside her, and for the first time since this meeting began, he realized the truth might not be hiding inside surveillance footage at all. It might be standing silently in front of him, wearing a faded blue work shirt and asking for nothing in return. The silence lingered long after Sophie's words faded into the vast atrium. Richard Harrison slowly knelt until he was at eye level with his daughter. The stern expression that had intimidated boardrooms for decades softened beneath the weight of something far more personal. "Sweetheart," he asked quietly, "what do you mean he noticed you?" Sophie looked toward Ethan before answering, almost asking permission with her eyes. Ethan simply gave a gentle nod. "You can tell your dad whatever you want him to know." Sophie took a slow breath. "After Mommy went to heaven, everybody kept asking if I was okay." She paused as tears gathered in her eyes. But nobody waited to hear the answer. Around them, dozens of employees lowered their eyes. Richard remained perfectly still. "They brought me gifts," Sophie continued. "New toys, bigger birthday parties, fancy trips. Everybody wanted me to smile again." She looked down at her small shoes. "But when I did not smile, they just tried something more expensive." Richard swallowed quietly. Sophie turned toward Ethan. "The first day I met him, he did not ask me to smile." Ethan looked almost uncomfortable becoming the center of attention. "He asked me if I had seen the little turtles around the fountain." A faint smile appeared on Sophie's face. Nobody had ever asked me something so normal. Richard listened without interrupting. The executives behind him had stopped pretending to check emails or calendars. Every person in the lobby understood they were witnessing something far more important than a corporate meeting. Sophie continued, her voice growing steadier with every memory. "When I could not sleep because I missed Mommy, he told me it was okay to keep loving someone who was gone." Richard slowly looked toward Ethan. "Did you tell her that?" Ethan nodded once. "Yes, sir." "Why?" Ethan answered with the same quiet honesty that had guided every conversation he had ever shared with the little girl. "Because my daughter still misses her mother too." Those words landed with unexpected force. Richard blinked. "You have a daughter?" "Yes, sir. Lily is 10 years old." Ethan reached into his wallet and carefully removed the slightly worn photograph he carried every day. He held it out respectfully. Richard accepted it. The picture showed Ethan kneeling beside a smiling blonde girl at a neighborhood playground. Nothing expensive surrounded them. Just sunshine, laughter, and an ordinary afternoon. "She is beautiful," Richard said softly. Ethan smiled with unmistakable pride. "She is the best part of my life." Sophie looked at the photograph and grinned. "He talks about her all the time." A few employees quietly smiled for the first time that morning. Richard continued studying the picture before returning it carefully. "Mr. Brooks, why did you never tell anyone who Sophie was?" Ethan looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Because it never mattered to me." Daniel Mercer frowned. "Surely you recognized her last name." Ethan shook his head. "Children deserve to be treated like children before they are treated like someone's family name." The words echoed through the atrium with remarkable simplicity. Richard lowered his eyes for a brief moment. He suddenly remembered countless evenings when business meetings had extended long after sunset. Countless birthdays interrupted by conference calls. Countless promises to spend more time together that had quietly become next week, then next month, then someday. Sophie had never asked for another expensive gift. She had simply wanted someone willing to listen. Richard looked back at Ethan with an expression no one in the company had ever seen before. It was not admiration yet, but it was no longer suspicion either. It was the beginning of respect. Then, as Ethan slipped the old photograph back into his wallet, something else briefly caught Richard's attention. Tucked behind Lily's picture was a faded newspaper clipping, its corner worn from years of being carried. Only a single photograph remained visible, but it was enough to make Richard's heartbeat pause. There was something strangely familiar about the face staring back from that forgotten piece of paper, and a memory he had buried years ago began quietly knocking at the door of his mind. Richard Harrison could not take his eyes off the faded newspaper clipping tucked behind Lily's photograph. Only part of the page was visible before Ethan gently slid the wallet closed again. But the image had already awakened a memory Richard had spent years trying to bury beneath board meetings and business victories. "Mr. Brooks," he asked quietly, "may I see that clipping for just a moment?" Ethan hesitated only long enough to understand the request before removing it with careful fingers. The paper was old, its edges softened by time, folded so many times that the center crease had nearly disappeared. Ethan handed it over without a word. Richard unfolded it slowly. The headline had faded, but one sentence remained clear enough to read. "Local veteran helps rescue family during highway pileup, then refuses public recognition." Beneath the headline stood a younger Ethan, wearing a volunteer emergency vest instead of a maintenance uniform. Richard felt the world around him grow strangely distant. Rain, flashing lights, twisted traffic. The memory returned all at once. 9 years earlier, during a fierce autumn storm outside Columbus, Richard's family had been traveling home. After a charity event, visibility had dropped to almost nothing as heavy rain swept across the interstate. Vehicles slowed. Tires lost traction. In the confusion, traffic came to a sudden standstill. Richard remembered climbing from his vehicle after everything settled, searching frantically for his wife and his terrified little daughter. Sophie had been only a toddler then, crying uncontrollably, frightened by the noise, the rain, and the strangers surrounding her. Before emergency crews arrived, one calm volunteer had appeared from nowhere carrying blankets from a nearby relief truck. Richard remembered that man kneeling beside Sophie instead of rushing past her. He had wrapped the little girl in a warm blanket, spoken gently until her crying slowed, and stayed beside her until paramedics confirmed she was unharmed. Richard had tried to thank him afterward, but the volunteer had quietly disappeared before anyone could learn much about him. The newspapers praised several emergency workers the following day, yet one name appeared only briefly before fading into history: Ethan Brooks. Richard slowly lifted his eyes from the article to the man standing quietly before him. "It was you," he whispered. Ethan seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. "Yes, sir." Richard looked stunned. "You were the volunteer who stayed with Sophie that night." Ethan nodded once. "She was scared." Richard shook his head in disbelief. "I searched for you afterward." Ethan smiled gently. "There were many people helping that evening. I was only one of them." "No," Richard replied, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard inside Harrison Global. "You were the one who stayed." Sophie looked back and forth between the two men. "Daddy, what is he talking about?" Richard slowly turned toward his daughter. "Do you remember the old yellow blanket you refused to sleep without when you were little?" Sophie's eyes widened. "The one with the tiny blue stars." Richard nodded. "The man who wrapped you in that blanket is standing right here." Sophie looked at Ethan in complete amazement. "That was you." Ethan chuckled quietly. "You held onto that blanket so tightly that I thought nobody would ever convince you to let it go." Sophie smiled through fresh tears. "Mommy always told me an angel found me that day." Ethan gently shook his head. "No, sweetheart. Just an ordinary man who happened to be nearby." Richard lowered the newspaper clipping, his hands trembling slightly. For months, he had allowed suspicion to cloud his judgment. For years, he had unknowingly walked past the very man who had comforted his frightened daughter during one of the darkest days of their lives. Around them, the entire atrium remained perfectly still. Daniel Mercer stared speechless at the faded article, realizing that every assumption he had carefully built had collapsed beneath one simple truth. And for Richard Harrison, the richest man in the room suddenly felt like the one who owed the greatest debt. No one in the atrium spoke as Richard Harrison carefully folded the old newspaper clipping and returned it to Ethan with both hands. The gesture was small, almost invisible, yet everyone watching understood its meaning. A man who had spent his life expecting others to reach toward him had just offered respect to someone the building had barely noticed the day before. Ethan accepted the clipping with quiet gratitude and slipped it back inside his worn wallet beside Lily's photograph. He did not smile with triumph. He did not look around to see who had witnessed the moment. He simply protected the two pieces of paper that reminded him why kindness had always been worth choosing. Richard slowly stood and turned toward the employees gathered throughout the lobby. His voice remained calm, but it carried a weight that reached every corner of the marble hall. "There has been a serious failure inside this company," he said. Several executives lowered their heads before he even continued. It was not committed by the man wearing the maintenance uniform. His eyes settled briefly on Daniel Mercer. It was committed by those of us who judged a person's value before learning his character. The silence grew even deeper. Daniel swallowed hard as Richard extended his hand. "Mr. Mercer, may I have the report you prepared?" Daniel hesitated before handing over the folder. Richard opened it slowly, glanced at the carefully selected photographs, then closed it again. "These images were not lies," he said, "but they were missing the truth." He looked around the lobby. Facts without compassion can become something very close to injustice. Daniel lowered his eyes. "Sir, I believed I was protecting your family." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "I believe you were trying to." He paused before adding, "But protecting people begins with understanding them." Daniel took a slow breath. "Mr. Brooks, I owe you an apology." Ethan answered with the same gentle tone he had carried since the beginning of the morning. "Thank you." Daniel looked surprised. "That is all you have to say?" Ethan smiled softly. An apology loses its value if someone demands more after receiving it. Several employees quietly exchanged glances. One young accountant who had often walked past Ethan without saying hello suddenly felt ashamed. A receptionist wiped away a tear. Even the security officers standing near the entrance relaxed their shoulders. Richard stepped toward Ethan. "Mr. Brooks, on behalf of Harrison Global and on behalf of myself as a father, I am deeply sorry." The billionaire extended his hand. Ethan looked at it for only a moment before accepting the handshake with quiet dignity. There was no competition between power and humility, only mutual respect earned through truth. The surrounding employees began clapping almost instinctively. The applause spread across the atrium until it echoed beneath the towering glass ceiling. Ethan looked genuinely uncomfortable with the attention. He gently released Richard's hand and glanced toward the maintenance cart waiting a few feet away. "If you will excuse me," he said politely. "The west hallway still needs to be finished before the afternoon meetings begin." Several people laughed softly through their tears. Richard blinked in disbelief. "You are going back to work?" Ethan nodded. "The floors still deserve to be clean." Sophie smiled as though that answer was exactly what she expected. Richard watched Ethan pick up the familiar mop handle with the same quiet care he had shown every morning for years. Nothing about the man's posture had changed. Recognition had not made him taller. Applause had not made him louder. Respect had not made him proud. It had simply revealed what had always been there. As Ethan slowly walked toward the west corridor, employees who had never noticed him before stepped aside without being asked. Some greeted him by name for the very first time. Others offered warm smiles instead of hurried glances. Ethan returned every greeting with equal kindness because he had never cleaned the building hoping someone would finally see him. He had simply believed that every honest job, no matter how ordinary it appeared, deserved to be done with excellence. And now an entire company had quietly begun learning the same lesson. The weeks that followed brought quiet changes that no corporate announcement could fully explain. Every morning Ethan Brooks still arrived before sunrise, parking his old pickup truck in the same distant corner of the garage. He still filled his bucket with warm water, checked every cleaning supply, and greeted the security officers with the same gentle smile that had never depended on whether anyone greeted him first. The difference was not in the man. The difference was in the people around him. Employees who had once hurried past without making eye contact now stopped to wish him a good morning. Executives who had never learned his name now thanked him when they saw polished conference rooms waiting for important meetings. Even the newest interns quickly discovered that the quiet cleaner knew almost everyone in the building and somehow remembered every birthday, every child's name, and every small kindness people had quietly shared with one another. Richard Harrison kept his promise to himself as well. Instead of filling every evening with conference calls, he began leaving the office before sunset at least 3 nights each week. Some afternoons, he waited outside Sophie's classroom just to walk her to the car. Other weekends, they visited neighborhood parks without photographers or assistants following behind them. For the first time in years, Sophie no longer measured her father's love by expensive surprises. She measured it by unhurried conversations, shared laughter, and simple moments that money had never been able to purchase. One crisp Saturday afternoon, Richard accepted an invitation that surprised everyone except Ethan. He drove to a small community park where Lily's youth soccer team was playing. The folding chairs were old. Parents carried homemade snacks instead of catered lunches. Children laughed beneath bright autumn leaves while chasing soccer balls across uneven grass. Richard watched Ethan cheering just as loudly for every child as he did for his own daughter. Sophie stood beside Lily within minutes, the two girls laughing together as though they had known each other for years. There were no important titles on that field. No reserved parking spaces. No executive offices. Just families grateful to spend time together beneath an open sky. As the afternoon ended, Richard walked beside Ethan toward the parking lot. "I would like to offer you a different position at Harrison Global," he said sincerely. "Better pay. Better hours. A management office if you want one." Ethan looked toward Lily and Sophie racing each other toward the playground swings before answering. "I appreciate your generosity." Richard smiled. "But," Ethan chuckled softly, "but I already have the job that lets me go home every evening knowing my daughter is proud of me." Richard nodded slowly, understanding far more than the words themselves. "Then at least allow me to make sure your work is respected the way it always should have been." Ethan extended his hand. "That would be enough." They shook hands once more, not as billionaire and cleaner, but as two fathers who finally understood what truly mattered. Before leaving, Sophie ran back one last time and wrapped Ethan in another heartfelt hug. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan gently smiled and placed one hand on her shoulder. "Remember what I told you." Sophie nodded confidently. "The most interesting thing about me should always be my heart." Ethan's eyes reflected quiet pride. "Exactly right." Richard watched his daughter climb into the car with a smile brighter than any he had seen since his wife passed away. He looked across the parking lot as Ethan lifted Lily onto his shoulders, both of them laughing beneath the golden evening light. In that peaceful moment, Richard finally understood a lesson that success alone had never taught him. Wealth could build towers that reached into the clouds, but only character could build a home inside another person's heart. And sometimes the greatest person in the room was never the one standing at the front. Sometimes it was the quiet soul holding a mop, carrying old photographs in a worn wallet, and changing lives without ever asking to be remembered.